As we settle into the quiet, let's begin our journey back in time to a far colder, more uncertain age. Long before our modern conveniences, when the arrival of winter meant more than chilly mornings and frosted windows. It meant survival. Picture yourself far from the noise and rush of today, walking slowly through the countryside of medieval Europe. The trees have long since shed their leaves, and the sky is pale and heavy. A weak sun hangs low, barely offering warmth. Beneath your boots, frost crunches along the edges of frozen earth, and a sharp wind begins to carry soft flakes of snow that swirl through the air. Winter is coming. But for people in this time, that phrase means something far heavier than we understand today. It means long months of deep cold, of empty cupboards, of illness and silence and hope stretched thin. In a world without heating systems, proper insulation, or stocked supermarkets, the cold isn't just discomfort, it's a threat. The chill creeps in slowly, but once it takes hold, it lingers. Lakes and streams freeze solid. The land lies motionless beneath thick blankets of white. This wasn't always the way. Centuries earlier, the seasons were more predictable. Winters still came, but they were bearable. But then, something changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the climate began to shift. By the 14th century, the world entered what we now call the Little Ice Age. Over the next several hundred years, temperatures dropped, seasons grew harsher, and each winter seemed more unforgiving than the last. The reasons are still debated, perhaps solar cycles, volcanic dust, or ocean currents, but the results were painfully clear. Crops failed. Animals died. And the wind cut deeper than it had in living memory. One of the most extreme examples came in 1709, during the infamous Great Frost. That year, temperatures dropped so severely that even mighty rivers froze solid. In London, the River Thames became a wide, icy avenue, shops and stalls were set up right on the frozen surface, and fires burned atop the ice. It must have been a surreal sight, ordinary life continuing atop a frozen river, but the beauty masked a brutal truth. That winter, thousands perished. The cold seeped through the stone walls of homes, and many didn't survive to see the thaw. And yet, in the midst of all this hardship, there were moments of strange opportunity. Isaac Newton, for instance, was a young scholar at Cambridge when the Great Frost forced the university to close. He returned home to his family's farm. With little to do but think, he spent long hours by the fire, contemplating problems in mathematics and light. It was during this isolated period that he developed early ideas on what would become calculus and modern optics. A quiet winter, a frozen world, and the spark of something entirely new. Still, for most people of the time, winter was less about discovery and more about endurance. The wealthy had thick cloaks, fireplaces, cellars full of salted meats and dried fruits. But for common folk, for laborers and landless peasants, the reality was far more grim. Picture a one-room cottage, its walls thin and drafty. A small fire sputters in the hearth. The air inside is thick with smoke, and the straw-covered floor offers little comfort. A family huddles together for warmth, wrapped in whatever cloth they own. They share their bed with children, sometimes even with animals, in the hope of sharing body heat. When they breathe, their breath hangs in the air, a pale mist that never quite disappears. Food is scarce. Breakfast, if it comes at all, is simple, a bit of porridge, perhaps, or a hard piece of bread softened in hot water. The stores from the last harvest are dwindling. And everyone knows that the worst is still to come. Outside, the livestock are just as vulnerable. Their coats are dusted with frost. They stand close together in the barn, their breath rising in clouds as they try to keep warm. And the people, they continue. They gather what wood they can, their fingers chapped and aching. They carry water, they tend the animals, they feed the fire when they can. They press on not because it's easy, but because there's no other option. This was the daily reality for most people in medieval times. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a constant trial. Every hour was a test of strength, of spirit, of endurance. But still, even in the hardest moments, glimmers of light emerged. The people of this time lived closely with the rhythms of nature. They observed the signs of change, the shape of the moon, the behavior of animals, the scent in the air before a snow. Their lives were deeply rooted in ritual and tradition. And so, even when the world was frozen and dark, they found reasons to gather. To mark the passage of time not only with hardship, but with celebration. One such moment came in late December, the feast of St. Stephen, held each year on the 26th. Though often overlooked today, it was a meaningful occasion in its time. For just one day, the rigid structures of feudal life were turned on their heads. A peasant or servant might be chosen to serve as the Lord of Misrule, a temporary king who issued humorous decrees and led the household or village in revelry. It was a day of music, dancing, laughter, and indulgence. Even those with little gave what they could. There were shared meals, warm drinks, and games played by firelight. It didn't last, of course. By the next morning, everyone returned to their usual roles. But for a moment, there was joy. There was something to look forward to. And perhaps even more powerful than the feasting was the simple act of togetherness. In a time when life depended not just on work, but on one another, the bonds of family and community became a kind of shelter all their own. In small villages, neighbors checked on each other during storms. If one home ran out of wood, another might share. A pot of stew would be passed across the threshold. Old stories were told again, not just to pass the time, but to keep memories alive. And even in the coldest days, even when the fire burned low, people believed, perhaps stubbornly, perhaps wisely, that spring would return. They watched for signs. A slightly longer day. The first thaw. The way the snow melted at the edge of a roof. When the time came, it was marked with quiet reverence. Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, was celebrated not with grandeur, but with gratitude. The idle ploughs were brought out once again, blessed in hopeful ceremony, and readied for the season ahead. A new cycle began. The earth, so long frozen, softened beneath the hand. The sun, though faint, was growing stronger. Life stirred once more. It's hard to imagine now, in our world of climate control and stocked shelves, what it meant to survive a medieval winter. But perhaps we can still take something from it. The knowledge that hardship does not last forever. That even in the darkest, coldest times, there is warmth to be found, in stories, in family, in shared effort. And that the promise of spring, while slow, always comes. This was their world. This was their winter. Cold, quiet, and long. But never without hope. Even the grandest estates of the age could not fully escape the grasp of the bitter season. Within vast, echoing castles, those cold stone structures with their tall towers and drafty halls, The nobility did not pass the winter in effortless comfort. While they possessed thick tapestries, heavy furs, and more abundant supplies, the truth remained: heat could not be contained easily, and the walls themselves seemed to radiate cold. Enormous fires roared in the hearths, but their warmth rarely reached the corners of those cavernous rooms. Beneath the polished surface of privilege, winter was still an adversary. Servants worked constantly to seal windows, stuff gaps in the stonework with cloth, and maintain the roaring fires that were their only true defense. Cooks salted and dried meats, turned root vegetables carefully in cellars, and watched over what little remained of the harvest. Even for the aristocracy, survival took effort. One old tale, half legend and half remembered history, tells of Queen Elizabeth of Hungary. It is said that she passed away from exposure in her own chambers, sometime during the freezing month of January in the year 1326. Despite her status, the story describes how she was found frozen stiff beneath layers of rich robes and furs. While the facts of this tale remain unclear and perhaps exaggerated by time, the deeper message remains vivid. Even the wealthiest could not command warmth. Winter crept into all lives, soft, quiet, and unrelenting. Yet, amidst the bleakness, people still looked toward flickers of warmth and meaning. For common folk especially, one such light was the feast of St. Stephen, a cherished moment of joy and rest held each year on December 26th. After the solemn traditions of Christmas Day, St. Stephen's offered something very different. It was a day of mischief and role reversal, where laughter echoed in village squares and the weight of hierarchy lifted, just for a little while. At the heart of the celebration was the selection of a commoner, a stable boy, a field hand, a washerwoman's son, to act as the lord of misrule. For this one day, they would wear a paper crown or a mock robe, issue silly commands, and preside over playful chaos. Revelry filled the narrow lanes. Children scampered through the snow. Adults, weary and lean from months of cold, shared drinks, danced, and tried, for a while, to forget the chill. Street games returned. Mummers performed their rowdy, comic plays. Jugglers, minstrels, and jesters offered distraction and song. And through the wind and the frost, laughter rose. The contrast between joy and hardship gave the celebration its true power. It wasn't about plenty, it was about relief. And of course, where there was celebration, there was food. Not lavish feasts by modern standards, but warmth in every mouthful. Roasted fowl, goose or pheasant, when possible, might be shared among many. A grand centerpiece, like the traditional boar's head, might be paraded through a hall with singing and cheer. Minced pies, packed with dried fruits and the rare spices saved from far-off markets, were considered a rare luxury. Wassail, a hot spiced drink of cider or ale, was passed around in wooden bowls, warming hands as much as bellies. As the festivities waned and villagers returned to their dim homes, they took with them more than the remains of food or fading melodies. They carried the feeling of community, of survival, that would keep them going in the weeks to come. A sense that, even as the cold wind continued to blow, they were not alone. That the strength to endure another day could be found not just in soup pots or firewood, but in one another. Still, the merriment faded quickly. January pressed forward with long stretches of darkness, often without sun. Snow piled high in lanes. Roofs creaked under the weight. Windows, where they existed, were iced from the inside, their light dimmed by frost. People huddled closer, not out of affection, but out of need. It was not uncommon for entire families to sleep in a single bed, their bodies tangled together with straw bedding and thin woolen blankets. Some homes shared walls with barns, allowing livestock warmth to seep through, and their breath mingled with the smoky, stifling air. And yet, it was in these cramped spaces, smoky, sour with damp, that stories lived. People told them in whispers, in long recitations, in repetition. Some were tales of saints and miracles. Others were parables dressed in local dialect, warnings or comforts passed between generations. These stories kept memory alive. They were not entertainment alone, they were structure. A way of understanding why the world was cold and why it would someday be warm again. But food continued to dwindle. And with it, energy. Dreams of the coming spring felt more like fantasies as fields lay hidden under thick snow. For the poorest, the weeks after midwinter were the most dangerous of all. The body, having burned most of its stored strength, had little left to give. A failed harvest from the previous autumn now showed its consequence. There was little left to trade. Grain had to be stretched. Meat, if it remained, was bone-thin and salted past palatability. Even the livestock began to falter. A goat too weak to stand. Chickens frozen in the coop. And yet the people endured. Because they had no choice. Hunger gnawed at the edges of every thought, but there was still work to do. A weak sun might coax someone outside to gather more wood or to clear snow from the roof. Others might walk to a neighbor's door, offering help with stitching a torn garment in exchange for a bit of dried root. The social bonds were strong, not by luxury, but by necessity. One tale from 1377 describes two peasant families who, finding themselves nearly out of food before the end of January, came together to share what little remained. A single cabbage, a few potatoes, stale bread softened in boiling water. Together, they made a single meal. Enough to carry them through another day. And in that shared pot, in that act of unity, was a power greater than any feast. It was what kept people alive. Kindness, not comfort, defined survival. And so did persistence. The ability to rise each day, to move slowly through tasks despite the cold that clawed at fingers and toes. To find meaning in routine. To take small comfort in rituals, lighting the fire, turning the grain, milking the cow. And somehow, against all odds, this cycle continued. Winter never truly relented, but it did begin to shift. The days grew, minute by minute. The thickest snows began to soften. Icicles dripped. And with that change, slow but steady, came a lifting of the heart. A hint that soon the world would stir again. This, then, was the essence of medieval winter, not glory, not drama, but endurance. Day after day. A life measured not in grand events, but in surviving what the land and sky demanded. And in doing so, in lasting, together, the people created something far more lasting than stone or song, resilience. As the cold months stretched on and the landscape remained locked in snow and ice, even those who had more, the modestly well-off, the landowners, the caretakers of manors and castles, found themselves pushed to the edge of comfort. Stone walls were no guarantee against the creeping frost. In fact, the cold often lingered longer inside than out, trapped in the heavy air of unheated halls. Wealth offered layers of wool, larger fires, and more food, yes, but it could not keep out the reality of winter's grasp. The season, with its indifferent silence and biting winds, humbled everyone in its own way. In many great halls, the cold settled deep into the floors, radiated down from ceilings, and curled in from every corner of exposed stone. Tapestries were hung not just for grandeur but to keep the worst of the drafts at bay. Hearths were stacked high with wood, and yet even roaring flames left the outer walls chilled. Staff worked tirelessly, keeping fires lit, sealing cracks, storing and rotating supplies, and checking on livestock quartered in distant barns. Even the best preparations sometimes fell short. Salted meats would spoil. Grains could mold. Firewood might run low during a storm. And yet, there were those who faced more than discomfort. Tales passed down spoke of a queen, Elizabeth Woodville, the consort of Edward IV, who was said to have succumbed to the cold within her own rooms. Though the details are lost to time and tangled with rumor, one version of the story claims she was found one morning, wrapped in finery and furs, but frozen still. Whether true or not, the symbolism speaks plainly: winter did not bow to rank or crown. The frost touched all. What helped people withstand the long months wasn't just fire and food, but ritual and rhythm. The return of each winter brought back the familiar patterns, the careful portioning of remaining grains, the quiet planning for Lent, the subtle calculations of when to cull livestock before they consumed more than they could provide. But there was also reprieve, brief and bright, in tradition. Though the revelry of St. Stephen's Day had long passed, its warmth echoed through the weeks that followed. That memory of shared feasting, jesting role reversals, and warm cider passed around to frost-numbed hands sustained spirits. For just a day, the strict hierarchy had been turned upside down. The Lord of Misrule had led a procession of laughter, the wealthy had played along, and the poor had danced with full bellies. That memory mattered. It gave people something to hold on to. Because beyond those rare feasts, life was defined by frugality. A half loaf of bread was stretched with thin broth. Root vegetables were boiled again and again. Dried peas and beans formed the basis of many meals. And water, sometimes frozen in buckets, had to be broken and warmed just to be used. Work continued because it had to. Firewood was gathered even when the forest paths were buried under snow. Tools were repaired again and again. Roofs were patched in the daylight, however pale it was. There were no days off from survival. But even amid these harsh realities, moments of connection emerged. Villagers helped one another not out of luxury, but out of mutual need. One family's failing fire might be saved by a neighbor's last branch of dry kindling. A widow might receive a bowl of hot water and barley from those who barely had enough for themselves. These acts of kindness weren't exceptions, they were the norm. They were how people endured. It's easy to think of medieval winters as only bleak and lifeless. But the truth is more layered. In those months of deep quiet, a different kind of life stirred, one rooted not in growth, but in resilience. Inside smoky, dim rooms, people told stories, not just for entertainment, but for survival. The tales reminded them who they were. Legends of saints, of spirits that roamed during snowstorms, of clever foxes and tragic queens. Some stories made them laugh. Others brought a quiet ache. All served to anchor the long days. Somewhere, in the corner of a low-lit room, a child might play with a bit of carved wood, imagining grand adventures. Nearby, someone stitched by candlelight, turning scraps into warmth. Life was slow. But it was life. As time moved forward, barely noticeable, small signs began to return. A day that ended just a little later than the last. A sound of water beneath ice. A patch of snow thinning on a slope that always caught the morning sun. These signs were quiet, easily missed. But to those who had endured the darkest hours of the season, they spoke volumes. Then came the earliest thaws, not all at once, but in trickles. Icicles dripped. Paths turned to slush. The scent of damp earth returned faintly to the air. For many, this was when hope bloomed again. Not in grand declarations, but in silence. A glance toward the sky that lasted a little longer. A smile exchanged over a simple bowl of soup. One of the most meaningful days that followed was Plough Monday, celebrated just after Epiphany. On this day, the community gathered to bless the ploughs that had lain idle since the ground froze. Oxen were adorned with ribbons. Children carried lanterns. And people walked the edges of the fields, now slowly softening under their boots. The plough was not yet used, the ground was still hard, but the act of bringing it out, of touching its worn wooden handle, was symbolic. It meant that the world was waking up again. That planting would return. That hunger would end, in time. And so, though the cold lingered and the nights remained long, the people stood a little taller. Not because the suffering was over, it wasn't. But because they had passed through the worst, as they had the year before, and as they believed they would again. Let us pause again here, in that quiet transition. The fire may still be low, and the snow may yet fall, but the air has shifted. A whisper of green waits beneath the frost. And the people, in their simplicity and strength, carry on. As the deep chill of winter held firm, and the frost etched silent patterns across every pane of glass and timber beam, the weeks wore on. In truth, this final stretch of winter often proved the most difficult of all. The first signs of the season's slow retreat, dripping rooftops, longer dusks, a thawing stream, only sharpened awareness of how little remained in the storehouses, how thin the kindling pile had become, how weary the body felt. Even in noble houses, the atmosphere remained strained. Despite great fires and vast pantries, illness crept easily in the close quarters, and warmth remained uneven. The halls might glitter with banners and braziers, but the biting cold crept upward from the stones, and the air still carried the sharp sting of damp and ash. In the smaller dwellings of the poor, winter had already stripped away comfort. Hunger sat heavily. Bread had grown stale, if there was any left. Salted meat, once hoarded carefully, was long gone or rationed by the sliver. Meals became thinner, thinner still, a bowl of gruel here, a root softened in coals there. Even the livestock suffered. They stood listlessly in the straw, steam curling from their nostrils, eyes dull with the weight of the long season. Peasants now feared the cold less than starvation. The dull ache in their limbs, the lightheadedness after rising too quickly, these were signs that reserves were running low. Illness came, as it always did in close, cold quarters. In places where windows remained shut tight and smoke from cooking fires gathered thick in the eaves, infection spread rapidly. The common cold was never truly common in its effect. A simple fever could unravel a life. Coughs turned deep and wet. Pneumonia took hold of the vulnerable. Children, especially, fell prey. Their small lungs could not withstand the air, heavy with damp and soot. In many villages, it was said that a single winter could take as many lives as the worst harvest. The winter of 1557 stands out as a particularly grim example. A fierce wave of influenza surged across Europe that year, claiming tens of thousands in its wake. In Paris alone, it's said more than 10,000 souls perished, many within a matter of days. The fevers came fast and fierce, made worse by thin diets and bitter draughts. And yet, people continued on, tending to the sick, sharing what little broth they could muster, and laying out the dead with the quiet reverence of those too tired for weeping. Even royalty was not immune. Courts, for all their pageantry, were breeding grounds for disease. Servants, merchants, and messengers came and went with frequency. One minor infection brought from afar could spread quickly through the corridors of power. King Henry VIII himself lost his third wife, Jane Seymour, not to war or poison, but to postnatal complications, the kind worsened by the poor hygiene and damp conditions of the time. No title could protect one from infection carried by stale air and shivering hands. Perhaps the most fragile of all were the newborns. To be born in the depths of winter, in a cold cottage without fire, was a dangerous thing. Many infants did not survive to see the first thaw. In cities like London during the 1500s, nearly half of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Among the poor, a custom took shape, a small, black ribbon tied around the wrist of a sick infant, called bone lace. If the child passed, the same ribbon would be used to secure their burial cloth. It was a quiet ritual, but one repeated far too often. And still, despite these tragedies, people persisted. With blankets pulled tight and firewood carefully divided, they waited. The wind howled less frequently now. Snow fell in finer, wetter flakes. Icicles softened and dropped. And though the hunger did not ease, there was something in the air, something changed. A sound returned to the landscape, the slow creaking of thaw. As ice melted, it released trapped air with a soft sigh. Birds, long silent, began calling again from bare trees. Paths became muddy, not frozen. And beneath the slush, the land breathed. The people noticed. They always noticed. They began to look toward the fields again. To test the ground with the heel of a boot. To watch the livestock for signs of renewed energy. Plough Monday, though already marked, was now taken more seriously. The ploughs were not just paraded but readied. Oxen were fed better. Tools were sharpened. The soil, while not yet ready, gave hints, a darker patch, a sun-warmed corner, that the growing season might yet return. Spring, in medieval Europe, did not arrive like a curtain rising. It crept. But to those who had waited all winter, the slow return was sacred. The thaw was not just a change of temperature, but a triumph. A silent declaration that they had endured another year. The memory of suffering did not vanish. But it changed shape. It became a story of the storm that broke the roof, of the week they survived on dried beans alone, of the neighbor who shared firewood on the worst night. These were not tragedies, but proof. Proof of strength. Proof that hardship could be endured, if not conquered. In the quiet of early spring, as green returned to the hedges and birds flitted low over softening fields, a calm settled over the land. The tools came out. The shoes were repaired. Blankets were aired. And the rhythms resumed, slower at first, but stronger with each day. If there is something to carry from this world into our own, perhaps it is not just the image of hardship, but of resilience. They did not have central heating. They did not have refrigerators or medicine or thermostats. And yet they lived. They cared for one another. They celebrated when they could. And they waited with patience, with weariness, and with hope. So the next time a bitter wind rattles your window or your breath curls in the air as you cross a street, take a moment to remember them. The unnamed families who huddled under thatch roofs, who stirred thin stews, who held hands in silence when the cold grew sharp. They are long gone now, their stories scattered like ash. But their strength remains in the ways we care for one another, in the quiet patience we carry through our own winters. And as you settle now, in your warm bed, the wind softened outside your own window, perhaps spare them a thought and a quiet admiration. For those who lived through winter, one fire at a time.